indicate an expected regress in our development agenda. It is also worth to take a step back to analyze this situation, as this is the first time in the world that advanced economies growth is above global growth, and global growth is above emerging market growth. Although some larger countries in developing Asia, such as Indonesia, China, and India, have continued to grow, large parts of the developing countries have shown signs of stagnation. This is exacerbated further by higher levels of both public and private debt, and this worsening condition may present a potential risk for the global economy, especially when advanced economies decide on a more resilience-based value chain that may pose risk in terms of capital outflow, divestments, and eventually leaving economic scarring effect to developing and least developed countries. That's the reason why we at IsDB have taken a proactive approach to support rebuilding inclusive global value chains as pathway for global economic recovery. Before we start our session, I'd like to first introduce our panel of speakers who will share their thoughts on this topic. First, we have Dr. Radin Siliwanti, who is the Multilateral Funding Corporation Director at the Ministry of National Development Planning, or Bappenas, from Indonesia. Dr. Radin Siliwanti is an experienced development policy maker who also heads the Indonesian delegation to development working group meetings at G20. Welcome, Dr. Siliwanti. Second, we have Mr. Hussein. Second, we have Mr. Hussein Diabate, who is Director of Africa at GOPA Group, a leading consulting group in international cooperation and development. He has led extensive development projects funded by the main donor community in developing least developed countries as well as fragile and conflict states. A warm welcome, Mr. Hussein.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you. Third, we have Mr. Monzer Hanfir, who is a seasoned professional with a strong background in business consulting, digital transformation strategy, and investment advisory for both private and public sectors. He's assisting governments to develop innovation ecosystem and manage infrastructure projects in order to better integrate in a global value chains. Welcome, Mr. Hanfir. Fourth, and finally, we have Ahmad Warfa, Senior Global Value Chain Specialist at the Islamic Development Bank. Ahmad Warfa holds a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University and has been leading the technical analysis for IsDB's post-COVID-19 recovery strategy for Guinea, based on the very theme we are speaking on today, rebuilding inclusive global value chains. Welcome, Ahmad Warfa. Before I pass the floor to our speakers, I would like to set some context for our discussion in this session. The global value chains, as we know, is the backbone of the global economy. I'm sure you can remember the incident in Suez Canal a few months ago. The blockage cost $6.7 million per minute and about $10 billion a day. The owners of the goods stranded due to this blockage could not afford rerouting any of their vessels because it would take longer and it would cost them more. Why is this so? This is because the entire global value chains that supports productions have inputs and intermediate goods and services that run cross-border in most efficient way. This is what we call as the efficiency-based value chains. When efficiency is achieved, savings from it can be reinvested further. It also contributes to specialization with longer production length, allowing spillover effects to many industries with cross-border transactions, and supports the expansions of services industry. This was a typical setup just before the pandemic. It has some drawbacks too. It's not perfect by itself. However, some policy measures can mitigate the negative impact of it. Since the pandemic, there is a growing trend due to many factors such as decoupling of certain value chains, the inability to access certain inputs and the drive towards domestic production, which has led some countries to shift towards building a more resilient value chain. A value chain that a country can fully control or to some level have some control. We have seen some countries investing on building a completely resilient value chain. What is the cost of rebuilding a resilient value chain that focuses mainly on domestic production? Just like the Suez Canal blockage, the alternatives to efficiency will be cost and time. If countries focus on rebuilding resilient value chains at the extreme end, the increase in cost and price, which we are starting to see with the inflationary pressures in some advanced economies, we might see the collapse of the global economy. But many analysts sort of miss out the higher cost in production due to reshoring activities that is also leading to these inflationary pressures. That's the reason why we argue that rebuilding inclusive global value chains is paramount to global economic recovery. The efficiency and resilience-based value chains at the extreme ends will not benefit the global economy, particularly the developing countries. In this circumstance, we see many developing countries, especially among IsDB member countries, have reduced fiscal and monetary space, higher corporate and sovereign debt, and low capacity for growth. In a situation like this, with minimum resources, countries need to stimulate economic activities in a more targeted way. Since the beginning of the pandemic, IsDB has started to take up this challenge. We have identified that in order to stimulate economic activities in a more targeted and inclusive way, the global value chain lenses, which breaks up all economic activities, is analyzed and in a rapidly changing global dynamics brought by COVID-19. IsDB's member country partnership strategy is already using this targeted approach. One example is how, as part of reshoring activities, many automotive multinational firms have downsized their operation or completely ceased operations. In the automotive industry alone, 2 IsDB member countries suffered the worst decline globally in terms of production of vehicles. Algeria lost 90% of its production, and Indonesia lost 46%, followed by Morocco 38% in 2020 alone. In both Indonesia and Morocco, understanding the dynamic situation of the automotive industry enabled us to support the countries to new and future value chains, which is the electric vehicle value chain. Our interventions will support building an ecosystem for the electric vehicle value chain and raise competitiveness of both countries in this industry in an inclusive way. If we don't view this from the global value chain perspective, we would have left the key metals for electric vehicle batteries, which are mined in both countries, nickel in Indonesia and cobalt in Morocco, just as mining industry without any linkage to the global dynamics. Finding an opportunity like this is not an easy task, given the global pandemic and the worsening situation, especially in developing countries. With limited resources, how can firms and governments be supported with targeted interventions that helps them recover in an inclusive way from the pandemic? I would like to now invite our panelists today, Mr. Khanfir, to provide us some first-hand account on how companies are surviving or trying to survive during the ongoing pandemic in light of such dynamic global condition. Mr. Khanfir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed Faiz, and welcome all to this session. I will try to share with you some insights from the ground. I'm heading a think tank, and we are concerned by economic development and, of course, public policies. And what we lived in North Africa in particular, but I think in all the continent and in different parts of the world, is that a correction of the course of the history. We are just entering the cognitive era. This is a post-industrial era where services are dominating products, where intangibles are much more important for competitiveness than the equipments and tangibles. So you see, what happened with the pandemic is just a wake-up call to say, okay, you have to rethink about value chains and the strategy, industrial strategies. And what we are watching today is that even though there is a decrease in growth rates, it doesn't mean that there is no development, because development is not 100% correlated to growth. You can have local development, which is not perceptible for economists, which is not integrated immediately to macroeconomic indicators. Let's take the example of the shutdowns. Okay, during the first waves, many countries decided to shut down and to enter the confinement period. In Tunisia, where I have some statistics, 34% of companies, industrial companies, work outdoors and stopped totally their activities. After the second waves, of course, they restarted, but only half of them restarted properly. Okay, so we think that we will lose maybe around 16% of the companies. They will probably stop definitely their activities. Governments are putting a lot of money in the circuit, financial system, to try to avoid the dispersion of these companies. But it is not really the issue. Why should we think only to save all, let's say, generation companies and not to promote new ones, startups, digital startups? And there is here the dilemma. Of course, we cannot only think about future, we have also to think about the past. But we, I think, encourage investors and financiers to think about supporting more the new digital economy in order to help, let's say, a new generation of entrepreneurs and more innovation to tackle the issues you mentioned earlier, Dr. Mohammed Faiz.
All right, thank you. Thank you for your views, and I really appreciate the fact that the statistics that you have shown, especially from Indonesia, and this would be very interesting for us to move to the next question, because our next panelist is Dr. Radin Siliwanti. My question is that there is a global consensus that the global economic recovery must be supported by targeted interventions. From the experience facing the challenges of the pandemic, could you please share some challenges in finding targeted interventions and development impact of the pandemic in Indonesia, perhaps? Dr. Radin Siliwanti, the floor is yours.
Thank you, moderator. Dr. Muhammad Faiz, thank you so much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So the question is really relevant with what we in Indonesia, as of course the other countries, are facing the recent times. We admit that the pandemic is very, very difficult to predict, as well as it is not easy to determine developmental impact plan to respond the pandemic and resilient from the next pandemic and recovery, and finding the targeted intervention. Around last May, we still regarded that the pandemic is under control, and then in short, we launched several programs to improve tourism, to mitigate economic slowdown in several regions. But with the spread of the Delta virus variant in Indonesia since the beginning of June this year, we experienced a drastic increase cases. We previously had several ambitious targets in tourism sector, since the sector has a large multiplier effect to the economy. Yet, to the pandemic, projection on tourist arrivals has faced sharp correction. So to mitigate the impact of the pandemic, as what the other countries done, the government of Indonesia has performed a mapping and analysis on the sector that are most affected by COVID-19, such as health, education, tourism, industry. Several industries collapsed. and formal, informal sectors such as micro, small, medium enterprises. Actually, for example, micro, small, medium enterprises is facing a downtrend due to the physical and social distancing or social restriction, reduction of work hours during the pandemic, decreased demand due to the lower public purchasing power, as well as capital crisis to the credit restructuring. Yes, COVID-19 affects not only the demand, but also the supply side of small, medium enterprises. So, you know that it's this very, very unstable situation. Furthermore, we found that there is an increase on poverty and employment, a reduction in access to education, a significant increase in COVID positive rate, and the health security system had broken down. And the last current issue is that access to the vaccine is a big challenge, and so on, I think. In other words, COVID-19 has impacted life and livelihood of people negatively. The COVID-19 pandemic caused a setback in the society standard of living, which is in turn caused the society to become more vulnerable than before. Our mapping and analysis shows this is for the agriculture sectors. It had a minimum impact from COVID-19 pandemic compared to the other sectors because of physical distancing and social restriction. Agriculture sector has supply chain disruption and decrease in demand, but it is relatively resilient. We can call that the agriculture is as a buffer sector. We had experienced the resilience on these agriculture sectors in previous crises. To address the pandemic-induced difficulty faced by our society, the government has planned several intervention targets on social and economic sector through the provision of direct social assistance program to the society in the form of direct cash transfer, pre-employment benefits, wage subsidies for those who lost their sources of income, and credit relaxation support, especially for the small medium enterprises. This is just to extend the grace period. I would like to highlight that health sector for Indonesia is a priority for economic recovery, but on the other side, we have to revive and maintain the economic activities. It has been very, very difficult situation since we have limited resources. However, and therefore, as a result of the mapping, the government has also taken a decision to balance between health and economic policy, with notes that we have to decide which economic sector that need to be restricted and need to be limited to also avoid the constant decrease of the economic activities. As a priority and intervention target, we also pushing other economic potential that have not been empowered intensively, such as economic digitalization. With digital technology, we are working to capture the potential demand that have been corrected due to the social mobility restriction. The reduction in demand due to partial isolation or mobility restriction could be offset through online shopping in order to fulfill the needs of the society. So I believe that the technology and digitalization, it opens up our new avenue that it cannot only be used in terms of the economic activities, but also for the other sectors such as e-learning on education, telemedicine on health sectors. So in the course of time, intervention plan on the health sector is not as straightforward as we imagine. We are facing several challenges during the implementation, including like the limited stock of the vaccine in Indonesia due to the global competition to acquire vaccine, inability of existing industry to provide sufficient oxygen required for the patient and with severe symptoms, reduced number of health and medical workers, and high mortality rate among the medical workers. The intervention in the social and economic sector are still facing challenges, such as issue on the assistance recipient data between central and regional government, which still need to be integrated. Therefore, we have one data program in which now several positive outcomes are starting to appear from the increased number of validated assistance recipients. So I think that that's the story of Indonesia on how we respond to the COVID-19. I hope that it could inspire you how we how we take a decision on to put and to determine like the target and also the development impact plans. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Radin Siliwanti. I think it was very insightful with the fact that, Indonesia went through a mapping exercise to come up with, the targeted interventions, which really, is quite aligned to how ISDB is also doing the member country partnership strategy, which we will discuss later on as well. Now, moving on, as we have heard from the firm, and also from the policy perspective, I would like to now invite Mr. Hussein Diabate to provide some views on how the challenging landscape, especially from the donor community, may have impact in least developed countries, especially in Africa. Given your vast experience with the donors and also multilateral institutions in Africa, how do you see countries adapting to all these new changes? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohamed Faiz. And I'm really pleased to be here today. And in fact, the COVID crisis is in Africa to be taken in two parts. It is on the one hand a challenge, but from my perspective, or our perspective, it is also an opportunity for Africa. Why? The challenge is that at the beginning of this crisis, all of us, also the donors, assumed that the health sector will be the most affected in Africa. And we learned that the health sector had not been so affected as planned at the beginning, because the infection rate was lower than in other countries. But in opposite to Indonesia, we realized that other sectors was impacted. For example, the agriculture sector was impacted because hotels, restaurants, bars were closed, so that the farmer were not able to move the product from the village to the big cities. We had a problem in the education sector because children were obliged to stay at home, and only countries who had a good homeschooling system have been able to manage this challenge, but most of the countries were really affected because this required a very good digital infrastructure that is not existing everywhere. So the economic sector has been really impacted. As Siliwanti said, we realized a decreasing of the tax revenue of the countries because of the slowdown of the private sector economy. So this is example of sectors that are affected. And for the donor side, I must say we were very, very positively surprised, because the reaction of the donors at the beginning of the crisis was really quick. And they gave us as consultants the opportunity to be flexible in the management of our project on site, because they try to help the countries to satisfy the demand as soon as possible. So this was a positive thing. Now, the donors are focusing on the rebuilding of the sectors affected, and this is what our team are doing on site. Now, coming to the opportunities, I think we learned from this crisis that it is important to have a good local functioning market. And most of the big African countries are export oriented. And now, for this crisis, they learned that they have to improve their internal market. An example of that is our company, EFC, based in Bonn, is currently carrying out several projects in Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, where we are supporting farmers in the transformation of their agriculture product. That means we are helping them to make the first transformation in order to satisfy the local market. For example, in Cote d'Ivoire, you can imagine Cote d'Ivoire is the biggest producer from cocoa on the world. And just a few, or let's say, for the export, it is allowed to use just a specific size of beans. So that means the other beans have to stay in the country. And we are helping them now to use such remaining quantity to create, for example, briquette to be used in the energy for household. In that way, you can see that we are trying to help them to have a local value chain market that is functioning. We learned also that countries started fabricate their own COVID mask. So this is a good example. But I think this crisis is just pushing something in the way of the new created free African continental free trade area, because this new free trade area has the objective to create a big market. And this big market has to be used by African countries to develop their industrialization. And they can just benefit from that if they are producing their own product. And therefore, I think the current situation is just pushing them to start these internal processes. We learned also that Africa is very interesting now for industry in Europe. For example, for the automotive industry, German producers are really now pushing to go to Africa in order to create their also a production. In Rwanda, for example, or in Morocco, we see that they are really interested, and this is a very positive development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your insightful remarks. And I think one of the key takeaway from your remarks just now is regarding the fact that in Ivory Coast, when the cocoa bean, as the largest cocoa bean producers, during the pandemic, how the cocoa beans, some of the cocoa beans were used for other purposes, for processing and so on and so forth, which is a very targeted intervention. And I think this kind of example moves very nicely to our next intervention by Ahmed Warfa. Because Ahmad Warfa is part of the first country where we have reoriented the strategy of the bank under the theme of, under the restart track of the member country partnership strategy in Guinea. Perhaps, Ahmad Warfa, you could walk us through how ISDB is supporting in its member country in this track. Ahmad Warfa, the floor is yours. Ahmed Warfa, I believe you are muted. There's some Yes, only now we can hear you.
All right, excellent. I'll just start over again. As you mentioned earlier, we have multiple pathways of how the pandemic has affected our member countries. So I just wanted to summarize very quickly from two perspectives. One is from a supply perspective. You see that in many of our member countries, we have had a lot of lockdowns, and this resulted in job losses, some of which would come back and others have gone permanently. We have had reduction in output and exports. supply chain restrictions and the closures of borders. At the same time, also we have liquidity crises. If you look in many of our member countries, we have high levels of non-performing loans from SMEs. From the demand perspective, incomes have gone down, both from government revenue perspective as well as household perspective. At the same time, also you have fluctuations in commodity prices. Now they have gone high because of course, partly supply chain constraints, but they remain volatile. And for many countries, these increased prices have not resulted in shared benefits. Lastly, with the supply chain constraints, we see there is significant levels of inflation, and this is also, of course, compounded by quantitative easing and expansionary monetary policy. So all this means that in many of our member countries, many of whom, of course, are developing, the result is you have higher levels of, let's say, food prices, and resulting also in lower income levels. So as the bank, we have really a tough job. We try to summarize it in saying that we have a policy trilemma. The countries are faced with three challenges. One is that they're expected to meet the changing needs in infrastructure, education, healthcare infrastructure. Secondly, how to contain the increase in public debt to meet emergency spending. And lastly, how to mobilize more government revenues in the face of declining economic activity. So the challenge we have as the bank is how do we emphasize competitiveness and efficient use of the bank's resources in partnering with our member countries as development partners, and how do we ensure that our activities are targeted towards the sectors that have a maximum impact, socioeconomic impact, and translates to the rest of the economy. So as we see it, we have come up with a methodology that has changed to be more dynamic and more lean in the face of the pandemic in order to be more responsive to our member countries. And the idea is, how do we ensure that our interventions are targeted towards improving competitiveness in our member countries? So first, really, we have an in-depth in-house methodology we developed on how we select the highest potential industries in the country. And for that, we have three lenses. One is we have a focus on the natural potential, which is the natural endowment of the country. We try to be dynamic by looking at how the industry will develop, to account for the mega trends that would affect, the trajectory of the sector. In the case of, let's say, Guinea, we have in the mining sector, one mega trend would be, let's say, the EV revolution, electric vehicle revolution. The demand for some metals like aluminium would be increasing significantly. So, that's a sector that we should be targeting now in order to take advantage of future demand. So this is what we call preliminary analysis. It is, done in consultation with the country to select the highest level of economic activities. Then subsequently, we conduct an in-depth mapping of the economic activities by the value chain. We have a lot of consultation with the different parts of the value chain players, from the production side all the way to the marketing distribution, to discussing with the lead firms in the country. And we do this through what we call it evidence-based firm level surveys. And the reason why this is important is because in our efforts to be targeted, in our efforts to be efficient, we need to be responsive. So the information we collect has to be real-time and dynamic, so that our interventions are relevant and are able to tackle the inefficiencies and bottlenecks that we identify. We do have quite a significant bit of stakeholder engagement, both from the government side. We meet with the different land ministries. We meet with Chamber of Commerce, business associations, to ensure that we have, as well as civil society, that's quite important, to ensure that we have a holistic, understanding of the sector, and to make sure that the bottlenecks we identify are, the ones that are holding back the sector. So lastly, we compile, all this information to come up with a pipeline of interventions that, from our analysis would deliver the highest development impact, and not just from the sector perspective, but also to have a higher multiplier and to have more spillover to the other parts of the economy. So this comprehensive program that targets ultimately value addition, employment generation, and income generation is, the methodology that underpins what we call our member country partnership strategy. So I will speak more on Guinea and how we moved from, let's say, analysis from the preliminary perspective, where we identified the two sectors. In our cases, in the case of Guinea, it's mining and agribusiness, and how we ultimately arrived to an intervention. So maybe in the probably next round, I will give through a stylized example how we do that at the bank. Over to you, Dr. Faiz.
Thank you very much, Ahmed Warfa. In this first round of questions, I can summarize that in the background of resilience versus efficiency, value chain setup, firms, countries, and donors are facing multiple challenges to support countries. The developing and least developed countries are in a more vulnerable situation, I would say, especially to stimulate economic activities and enhance growth. Although we have some examples of success factors, we have to try to amplify this to the next level. IsDB GVC-based MCPS has provided a window of opportunity for countries to have a more targeted development intervention. And we hope that in the next round of questions, we can explore this further. So let me now perhaps go back to Mr. Khanfir. Given the challenging situation faced by countries and firms, what type of interventions can MDBs such as IsDB focus on to maximize impact on firms and hence job creation? The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I will rely on my presentation to give you better insights. Let's go to the slide number 3 directly, please. So, okay, here we are. Past, please, past slide, not this one. So what number 3? Yes, that's good. We are living in a paradoxical situation. Since 20 years, the global offer of products and services exceeded the total solvable demand. That means the capacity or invested in the investment of the stock of investment is more dedicated to producing capacity rather than efficiency. So we were already in a kind of resilience, let's say. The problem is that among this stock of investment, some are very, let's say, competitive because they get to a level where technology is, they are dominating by technology, but also they are dominating by the geography. That means they are located in the best place where to produce, and they have a very nice or very strong and efficient supply chain. So the efficient global value chains are the ones that are backed by a very effective and performing supply chain. And from there, you can see and you understand what happened during the pandemic crisis when we were confronted to a big chaos once we stopped the distribution. And rebuilding global value chains on the basis of resiliency means that we have to reconfigure the supply chains and to think more about local supply chains, green supply chains with recycled products probably, and to think more about the climate. And this is what is happening. So we have now a lot of climate funds, and they are not really today spreading over the continent, in Africa in particular. I see still impact funds, but they are more concerned by competitiveness rather than resilience. So this is the first observation. The second observation, next slide, please, is related to the way we are looking at the economic system. The economic system is not only industrial activities to address a market need. It's much more an ecosystem, let's say it like this. It's a complex network of stakeholders that are looking to the value produced, but also to the impact of this value produced. In particular, this will need a health system backing all these activities. And this health system, let's say it in a simple way. Let's consider agri-food value chain. The agri-food value chain, we are now not only selling the products, but we are selling also the data. Data means traceability, for instance, where it has been produced, what are the pesticides and the fertilizer that has been used, in which country, in which place, etc. I mean the crops, where the crops has been done, and we are selling more and more products and data, and we need to valorize data. And data is much more related to the health system and sanitary system rather than the production of the crops itself. So you see, the risk management here is not only how to produce and how to distribute, it's also how to track all these and to make the best combination in order to reduce the impact on the environment and to be probably very close to the market demand in a way that we don't need to make thousands of kilometers to distribute a product, because we can have an alternative for that. Okay, next slide, please. The next slide is about the concept of supply chain itself. We are moving from the old supply chain model to what we call the supply network model. And what does it mean? It means that we are using more and more technology to connect capacities to local capabilities and to address the demand and the fluctuation of the demand and the emergency, in case of emergency, in order to give the best, let's say, ratio of efficiency and service. And from there, we need, of course, to put more and more technology and to digitalize the activities, or to add technology and data management in the supply chains. So these are the three things I wanted to share with you, and this can give an orientation to the ISDB investment strategies. What does it mean? Just to make it brief. That means that we need to invest more and to orient more investment flows to technology infrastructure, because this is very important. And I saw there's a question from the audience about this. We need to strengthen the infrastructure, the technology infrastructure, in order to get the chance to new entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, to take maybe this opportunity to start new business and startups. And the second point, which is maybe now still not very clear to everyone, if we take always the best in class and we invest only on the best in class, we will not produce a resilient global value chain. Sometimes we have to go and help the ones who are not maybe ready today, but thanks to, let's say, the environment, and if we put an enabling environment, kind of innovation ecosystem, we can help them to build up, step by step, their capacity to go into the global market. And this is very important to consider in your investment strategy. And thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hanfer, for your intervention. I really appreciate your view. Just now, the last point that you made is that building resilience should not leave people behind, right? So the fact is that it should not be on the basis of leaving people behind, and there is opportunity if we have enabling environment built investment and interventions that focus on building this enabling environment, then we can at least ensure that it is more inclusive. The investments and also financing is more inclusive in that sense. So this really is a good example as we move on to the next question. But before we move to the next question, I would like to just remind the audience that you can post your questions in the Q&A tab, as well as in YouTube. You can also send in your questions. We will try to answer your questions once we complete this Q&A session. And please feel free to add on and asking the questions in the tab. So now let's move to the next question, Mr. Hussein Diabate, expanding the point that Mr. Khanfir mentioned just now on building resilience. We see that some of the after effect of the pandemic is some restructuring and reorganization of the global value chains. And considering supply chain vulnerabilities, right? The US administration, for example, came up with a White House paper, which is launched a comprehensive plan titled Building Resilient Supply Chains, Revitalizing American Manufacturing and Fostering Broad-Based Growth. Many of these specific value chains identified in this plan will have an impact on developing and least developed countries, especially in Africa. How do you think countries can benefit and in an inclusive way, especially in resource-rich countries?
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohamed Faiz. Yes, I think this is really a very important point, because on the one hand, if the demand from outside is big and the value chain, the global value chain is functioning, it is normal for foreign investors, for example, to follow their own interests or the interests of the country they are coming from. But they have to have also the interest of the country, the host country, in mind, because otherwise the investment cannot be sustainable. And we had the situation that in the past that some projects have been realized in the way where foreign investors focus just on their own interests. For example, the Desertec project, it is one of the biggest solar projects made in North Africa, where the European companies, energy companies, try to generate energy to be used in Europe. But the interests of the host country have not been taken into consideration properly. And we can see that the results of this project have been disappointed. This is the case in one of our projects managed by our company, Intech, member of the GOPA group, where we have been asked in a country to help the government to have a so-called power purchase agreement, because they started opening the market for foreign investors for solar energy. And they were not able themselves to provide such a contract. That is a duration of 30 years. And they asked the investor to make a proposal of contract. You can imagine what has been put in this contract. And a donor asked us to intervene, and we were able, in fact, to propose a contract, a power purchase contract, PPA, contract to the country that preserve its interest also in vis-a-vis of the investor. And now we have a very interesting discussion regarding hydrogen. You know that there is a new technology, hydrogen, very coming, and this is one of the solutions to reduce the production of CO2 in regarding the climate change. And in order to have this, let's say, this technology better used, that has to be done in a proper way. That means a green hydrogen. That means a production of hydrogen based of solar energy. And Africa is best placed to produce this solar energy to have a green hydrogen. But the problem is that the use of this hydrogen is now planned for Europe or America or Asia. But if Africa is not able, or the African countries they are now starting producing that, are not able to use that themselves, it is for sure that they will have some social conflict, some frustration in the country, and those investments cannot be safe. Therefore, I think if the tendency now is to focus on some countries to use their resources, the investors have to help them also to have a profit on it in order to have a win-win situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your sharing. I think very impressed with the fact that we are aligning our discussion here today with the fact that it's very important to build an inclusive value chain and also an inclusive way of growth post-pandemic, because there are countries that are focusing on rebuilding a very resilient value chain, and also there are plans that focuses on least developed and developing countries. But these recovery should be very inclusive. And I like your example, especially in Morocco. And that is an example that I think we have to take into account as a lesson learned, because a lesson learned that interventions and development projects should benefit all and should benefit the people as well on the ground. So moving on to that, moving on to the next question. Since we right now have some consensus building that having very targeted and inclusive interventions, Dr. Radin Siliwanti, I would like to have your view on what IsDB is currently doing in the global value chain-based member country partnership strategy. Since earlier this year, IsDB has embarked on the GVC-based MCPS that focuses on the theme of rebuilding inclusive global value chains in Indonesia. The strategy focuses on key industries, the agri-food, automotive, chemicals, and pharmaceutical industries in Indonesia, and how actually you see if these targeted interventions and also the process that we have undertaken so far can support Indonesia's recovery from the pandemic. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Besides supported by health sector services, economic recovery in Indonesia will be largely determined by the productivity and value added of Indonesia goods, products, and services in the global value chains. Mapping the sector using the GVC analysis can disclose actually the potential of Indonesia resources, supply and demand, and the absence of the Indonesia productivity in the global value chains. In regard to the pandemic, we can see some coherence actually in the Islamic government strategy with the government's needs, particularly in the chemical and pharmaceutical or petrochemical product sectors. Recently, in pharmaceutical sector, Indonesia has 3 COVID vaccine development initiative carried out by Universitas Airlangga. This is in Surabaya, West Java, in collaboration with PT Biotis Pharmaceutical Indonesia, by Ekman Institute for Molecular Biology, in collaboration with PT Bio Farma, and by the National Research and Innovation Agency in Indonesia. We acknowledge the importance of this vaccine research because Indonesia needs a large number of vaccines, which is around 426 million doses, with the current availability of only 30% or 150 million doses. Even this number is still based on the vaccine scenario that can overcome all variants of the COVID-19. With the threat of mutation, it is estimated that the need for vaccines will increase in the future. It is not only Indonesia has limited access to vaccine, now we're facing that, but also maybe the other developing countries. The progress of this initiative in general is still currently in the preclinical trial stage, there is still a long way to go for the transitioning to the vaccine industry process. For this reason, we still need support for the good manufacturing practice to be able to mass produce the vaccines. Certainly, we expect that the global value chain strategy from the Islamic Development Bank can also contribute to this initiative. Yeah, actually, in terms of the chemical and pharmaceutical, we have like a huge potential, I think, here in Indonesia. So that's why when the Islamic Development Bank assists us to using the what is global value chain, we see that we have to prioritize on this sectors. So in the agriculture and food sector, we're grateful with the result of the Islamic Development Bank study on the potential development of the cocoa commodity to become part of the global value chains. I think that a long history in Indonesia that cocoa actually this is potential, and also that the good quality of cocoa if we would like to have actually. We certainly use the result of the study as input to prepare policy intervention that can encourage the resilience of business partners involved in the cocoa commodity flow chain. The issues of cocoa is on I don't know how it's in English. Hama. What is Faiz? So the issues is on it's like the virus or bacteria, right? So to destroy cocoa in Indonesia. So this is actually the challenging, I think. However, apart from cocoa, we also have a target for food resilience, which has potential to be integrated into the global value chains. In the agriculture sector, main focus will be the development of food system revitalization for fulfillment of market needs and to recover job opportunities. The strategic plan for the national food system will ensure following areas: sustainable and availability of domestic production, and to cover safe and quality of food demand, conducive environment for local food industrialization development, food access stability, and enforcement of farmer corporation, and efficient food distribution and food grant for vulnerable food household. So I think that the analysis supported by the Islamic Development Bank, and this is actually our priority in our medium-term development plan, I think, for the next 5 years. So I think that it is really, really good. It is really, really matched in terms of the priority that the Indonesia needs, actually. Preliminary mapping and study shows that some agriculture products are highly potential to be developed further, such as horticulture, corn, palm oil, rice, seaweed, including fisheries product, especially shrimp. But you know that yesterday we're still discussing, we have to choose, for example, it's not all of for now. So maybe we will choose like horticulture, corn, and maybe fisheries, right? So on the other hand, for the automotive sector, we're also grateful for the Islamic Development Bank study on the automotive sector in Indonesia. According to the study in regards to the petrol engine-based automotive sectors, Indonesia has been able to reach the tier 3 basic component and tier 2 subcomponents levels of the global value chains. In the future, Indonesia can begin to focus on achieving the tier 1 level system module, such as electrical component, which currently have a very low production capability in Indonesia. However, following the determination of the Indonesian government to support the Paris Agreement on the climate change initiative in the form of effort to reduce CO2 gas emission by 29% by 2030 or 41% if we receive international support, we remain committed to our big development agenda, that is the green economy. For this reason, the automotive sector can begin to be directed to the focus on providing electric vehicle, it's supporting facilities infrastructure and battery for this vehicle. Thus, we hope that the Islamic Development Bank can conduct further study in the automotive sector to encourage our integration efforts in terms of the supplying electric vehicle component, as well as the supporting facilities and infrastructure components, such as component for electric charging station. Regarding petrochemical products, in line with the plan towards the green economy, we continue to strive for biodiesel to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. So I think that actually the automotive sectors is as a priority is in our vision 2045. So since Islamic Development Bank, of course, find this that maybe we have to start with the automotive sectors, not too much sector. So I think this is really match with our development needs, and the potential in terms of the battery in Indonesia is very huge. So we could use it optimally. With regard to the strategic global value chain, we also would like to mainstreaming the medium and medium enterprises involvement as much as possible into industries to be developed. Small medium enterprises, of course, plays a very significant role in our economics, and very also in many sectors which potential market is also still huge. So I think thank you for your question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Radin Siliwanti. It was really a good summary of what we were doing under the member country partnership strategy with Indonesia. In fact, as Dr. Radin Siliwanti mentioned, even yesterday we were having a long meeting with the authorities in Indonesia to discuss on the issues and problems that we are facing, and to actually have a more targeted intervention in the agri-food industry. Thank you once again. And now, as we move on to my last question, before we take any questions from the participants, I would like to have my last question to Ahmad Warfa. As you have explained earlier in your intervention about GVC-based MCPS in Guinea, could you describe some of the targeted interventions of ISDB in Guinea that can support medium to long-term recovery? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Faiz. I will circle back to my earlier slide. Just let me know if you can see them. So, as mentioned, as part of our trifecta of GVC lens, we looked at the natural potential, the dynamic potential, and the spillover potential, to select the highest potential industries. So in the case of Guinea, we ended up with two sectors. One is the mining sector, of course, with the high level of endowment in bauxite, and I'll show you in the next slide. We have high levels of reserves in gold. You have iron reserves, as well as emergent reserves like in cobalt and nickel. So it was really a sector that we had to focus on to take advantage of the country's natural resources and harness it for broad-based economic growth. So to come up with a set of targeted interventions and to come up with a comprehensive program for how the bank can be a development partner for Guinea, it was important to take a look at the mining sector from a holistic perspective. From our viewpoint, we see that mining is going to remain the dominant sector in terms of the destination for private investment, given that it comprises a significant % of export earnings. And as mentioned, it has a high level of natural endowment. It has the world's largest reserves. The advantage, or luckily, that in the face of the pandemic, the Guinean economy has been resilient because the pandemic coincided with increased demand from the countries in the Far East. China, in particular, was sourcing a lot of bauxite from Guinea, so that really helped to maintain the economy during the pandemic. However, at an aggregate level, even though it may look positive, if you look at the other sectors, the non-mining sector, there has been a lot of damage because of supply chain disruptions. You have, borders ended up closing, lack of mobility of, workers. So that resulted in job losses. And, Guinea has a significant share of the informal economy that is exposed to these disruptions. So you have job losses, and although we expect some of these jobs to come back, as mentioned, the impact on employment and productivity could persist even beyond the pandemic. So that's why it's important to have this dynamic, view of how we want to work with the Guinean government to ensure that our activities are aligned and are dynamic, also, as mentioned. So one other aspect of how the pandemic has been transmitted to the country is that you have increase in inflation, and in a country where you have high level of informality, that results in increase in food prices. And for vulnerable people, this means that the government has to provide more social support. So the challenge for the bank, of course, is how can we support Guinea's economic recovery through targeted intervention, without necessarily drawing resources away from the requisite social requirements. So as you've seen this slide already, just to show how the clusters of distribution in the mining sector, different minerals, different metals, how they're distributed. For the sake of this analysis, we just look at the bauxite sector, which from our analysis, we ended up selecting as one of the value chains of concern for our analysis because of the maturity of the industry, of the level of FDI that it can attract, and of course, how much spillover it can have for the other parts of the economy. So just to show you how comprehensive the analysis is, one of the things we have to do is we map the sector in terms of the connectivity, in terms of the access to markets, in terms of the existing levels of production and the location of production. At the same time, we also plan for the future by looking at where the future projects are going to be. We look at the energy infrastructure. How are we going to supply energy to these future projects, which in the case of mining is something that is always very energy intensive. So if you can see in the case of bauxite, a lot of the activities are concentrated on the northwest part of the country, the Boke corridor around here. So you have a lot of current mining activities, but also a lot of projects that are going to come online. So all this indicates that there's going to be really the increase in an increase in the contribution of the bauxite and aluminium sector to the Guinean economy. So it is, of course, necessary for us to take a deeper look into this sector to see how ISDB can work with the Guinean government to harness this sector for the benefit of Guinean citizens. So from looking at the bottlenecks of the sector, we really try to drill down into what are the constraints that are preventing the sector from achieving its full potential. And we can just summarize for the sake of this presentation into a few key constraints. One is that the enabling environment to evacuate the ores was weak, and the companies end up coming together to fund infrastructure projects. In the case of rail, for example, this is something that we can say is shared infrastructure, where you end up having railways that are being funded by private companies to evacuate product from the mines all the way to the ports. Another aspect is electricity access, which is low at the national level. In rural areas, it's much worse, and you see many of the mining companies end up investing in their own generation. At the same time, also, just give me 1 second. At the same time, also, you see that there's a significant potential for hydropower. I'll cover this in the next slide. Now, how do we turn this constraint into potential for unlocking the value chain? The other thing is that you have levels of education and skills were something which was a constraint for the sector development. You see the private companies cannot find profiles aligned to their needs. So just to reiterate, this evidence comes from the surveys and from the stakeholder engagements as the constraints that are key, or constraints that are really bottlenecks for the sectoral development. So for this presentation, I'll just focus on the electricity access and to see how, you know, in the case of lack of access to energy, how will ISDB address this through an intervention? So for each of these, you know, constraints, we have a different stream of analysis and interventions. And this is only for mining. So remember also we have agribusiness. All in all, I'm just trying to reiterate that it is quite comprehensive, the level of detailed analysis that we engage in, the level of stakeholder engagement to come up with something that, you know, is relevant and is, you know, really targeted for the country's future. So in the case of energy, for example, the country has high level of potential for hydropower, although access is still quite low. You have the source, many rivers that are major in West Africa stem the sources in Guinea. The country has doubled its own grid capacity, you know, and we expect that all this energy is going to be relevant for the expansion of mining activities downstream, as we mentioned in previous slides. So a good example is you have two projects. One is a 240 megawatt Caleta project, and the 450 megawatts Suapiti hydropower project, which I will expand on a bit later in this slide. The biggest constraint we have seen, apart from you know, generation, which is always capital intensive, is there's still high level of technical and commercial losses. And for the transmission sector, it is a sector that doesn't lend itself to private investment. It requires the public sector and regulators to really take control of it. It's monopolistic. So to drill down into the energy sector as the constraint, we have to essentially also map to see how the layout of the transmission map and the generating map looks like. You see there's a lot of thermal plants that are still the basis of Guinean energy infrastructure, even though, as we mentioned, the country has a lot of hydropower potential. So there are a lot of hydropower plants that were recently came online, and others are still in the pipeline. So we see the country is going to be a regional giant in terms of generation. And as part of the country's focus to be a net energy exporter, the bank is working with the Guinean government in several fronts to see how we can enable them to achieve this goal. So one thing we saw from the analysis is that there was a lack of transmission from one of the biggest power plants that recently came online. This is the Suapiti plant, to the demand center, which is in Bokeh. As we mentioned, this is the mining cluster. A lot of bauxite projects, current and future, are going to be around this corridor. So in this regard, the project we targeted is this transmission project. And this is just to show you back to a call back to the level of investment that is going to come online and will require energy. So the project itself, as we mentioned, is a 225 megawatt kilovolt transmission line from the Suapiti hydropower plant to the bauxite mining cluster. This plant just came online. It achieved full capacity in March 2021, and it's going to be, supporting the whole of West Africa, not just Guinea. So the constraint we saw on the project is how do we essentially address the lack of transmission capacity. You have the power that is stranded. The power plant came online, but the energy is not. We're not able to evacuate the energy to the demand centers in Bokeh and Conakry. So, discussion with the government and stakeholders, we realized that we can have this like a quick win project where we can construct a power line from the Suapiti hydropower plant to the downstream processing centers in the Bokeh mining cluster, and ultimately this transmission line would feed into the regional West Africa power pool and will be supporting the country's goal to be a net energy exporter. So the impact of this project, apart from supporting downstream activities, is that, as we mentioned, there's a pipeline of energy intensive projects that are coming on board, and we need to have reliable access to energy. So we're targeting ahead how to take advantage of that. Secondly, we have a paradox we call greenflation. Globally right now, increased regulation and the lack of renewable energy in many countries has discouraged investment into the metals that are necessary for renewable energy. So this, in the case of our context, aluminium. So to mine aluminium, we need energy, but many regulatory changes means that let's say firms do not want to invest in mines that are using, let's say, coal as an energy source. So this is really a chance for Guinea to position themselves as a global leader in mining, given that they're underpinned by renewable energy. The other thing, as mentioned, is that we expect significant spillover to the non-mining economy. So the government is planning to have a $1 billion special economic zone to support the non-mining economy. That would require reliable access to energy. At the same time, also, the access and the availability of low-cost generation compared to the previously available thermal power would result in a stronger competitive base that would allow mining and agribusiness to flourish. And lastly, in the view of trying to promote macroeconomic stability, we expect that the export of energy would result in increased level of foreign reserves and will help to shield the country from commodity price volatility. So just to show you how targeted this project is, if you look at it from a single viewpoint of an intervention, you can miss the big picture here, which is that we have mapped out the potential impact and outcomes of the project from a sectoral perspective. And as part of our analysis, we would really try to quantify the amount of, let's say, in the case of FDI, how much FDI can be unlocked, how much FDI can be expedited because of access to cheap and reliable energy. Same thing with the number of jobs. The sector, if you have a lot of downstream activities, it will unlock more, you unlock more high-level or higher-skilled jobs. So all in all, the message I'm trying to send is that we really are taking a comprehensive look at the sector with a view of working closely with the government to ensure that our investments are very targeted. The interventions are having significant spillover and sectoral impact. So, and without really overburdening the country in terms of increased debt load, as we mentioned, this is a situation that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. So I think that's it from my side. Over to you, Dr. Faiz.
Thank you, Ahmad Warfa. I think we have a few set of questions from the participants. Perhaps we are actually running out of time, but I would like to maybe take the opportunity to at least discuss a few of these questions. So one of the first questions that we have is that it's about digital economy and how countries, especially in Africa and Indonesia, are addressing digital economy issues. Because we had this discussion earlier, we were talking about one of the main problems that is faced by most of the governments or countries, especially in the social sectors, is because lack of digital economy and digitalization in the economy. So perhaps this question, I would like to direct it to Mr. Khanfir, if you're okay to take up this question.
Yes, please. So as mentioned earlier, digital economy could not rise without technology infrastructure. And from there, you can understand that we need to think about the investment through different lenses. And the first one is the public services that should be digitalized. That could be a booster for moving towards a digital economy. And the experience I have from the Tunisian case is that the biggest amount of investment will be in any case led by the government, because he will have the biggest part of the pie. He should move forward with implementing his strategy, and from there we will induce several businesses and several startups and innovation. That's why I believe that instead of focusing on public policies and how to innovate and how to address the challenges, economic challenges and inclusiveness and so on, let's put a framework for an investment plan to digitalize the economy, starting from the bottom, and the bottom is the public service. And if we start with this and we put enough money to induce the dynamic, we will have a much bigger result, and we will have the induced impact as we saw in the case showed by Ahmed. So this is one point. Then I just would like to invite also to think about the region or the regional integration. The investment that we can do in one country, because sometimes we can always argue that the country is small and we cannot put a lot of money and so on. We can mutualize infrastructure, and we can think cross-border in terms of infrastructure. And from there, you can see how things could be smoother and easier to attract investment and to attract financial flows. That's my comments, very briefly.
Thank you very much. I think you have covered two questions that we had, and thank you very much for covering the two questions. Some of the questions we have answered it online as well, but I would like to now go to another question, which is quite interesting because it was talking about the integration to the cocoa or chocolate value chain in Indonesia. Perhaps Dr. Radin Siliwanti, this is a question that maybe if you would want to answer it. So the question is that the insufficient cocoa bean production is one issue that is being faced in the cocoa chocolate GVC in Indonesia. And the second one is related to the attracting lead chocolate companies to invest in Indonesia. And this question is more on how the government is addressing these two issues. Is there any policy changes? Also, perhaps, Dr. Siliwanti, do you want to take this question? Perhaps Dr. Siliwanti is
yes.
Muted. Yeah. So. Yeah. Yeah, could you just explain in terms of the cocoa value chain, if there's any intervention by the government, like to address the issues on investments, like lead companies investing in Indonesia is one issue, and the other issue is that there's insufficient production of cocoa beans. Perhaps expanding on your earlier intervention, talking about the cocoa beans and also the issues such as bacteria and all that. Perhaps you can expand on what kind of policies that were undertaken by the government.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, I'm trying to answer this question. Yes. In the case of Indonesia, is the challenging how we can produce the quality and would like to integrate to the global value chain is the issues in insufficient cocoa production in terms of how we can plan and how we can deal with the pests. So I found in the English, the pests. So it is very, very crucial issues in Indonesia, and how we can attract the investors. Yes, you know that there is a market, right, for the cocoa, but in terms of the production, we need like the standard of the cocoa itself, the standard how to process, the standard good quality standard in terms of everything. So of course that if we are going to to integrate the cocoa into the global value chain, so we have to change our policy. So now we're still exercising the policy on how, and we do understand that, of course, we're still in the process, in the progress on how we can dealing with the cocoa as a part of our objective to integrate to the global value chain. It's not easy, but I think that we could do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Radin Siliwanti. I think as we are running out of time, I would like to just have another one last question, especially this question is related to regional integration. So the question talks about the fact that, you know, the main pillars of increased resilience is regional integration, because with regional integration, you sort of have some level of, resilience. And this particularly, you know, in the response to nearshoring and regionalization of value chains. So in the case of, other parts of the world, how do you see, especially in Africa and Asia, perhaps in Africa, this example, the examples that I think Mr. Hussein explained earlier, perhaps if Hussein, you could explain, how regional integration can actually perhaps build some resilience in the value chains, as what we have seen, like what happened in the European Union. Because of regional integration, there was some level of resilience. Can that similar situation be replicated in a region like Africa? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, this is exactly the reason why the new African continental free trade area has been created. I mean, you can imagine in the building of a regional integration is to have a big market. And this big market is necessary in order to face external shocks. That means that avoid all countries belonging to this region to be dependent to the outside economy. And you can imagine in Africa, in Western Africa, you have the Western, the Western Economic and Monetary Union based on 8 French countries. Then you have the ECOWAS with 15 countries, where the 8 countries of the French Union are in. Then you have in Central Africa the CEMAC. Then you have the Eastern Africa Community. Then you have the IGAD. Then, you know, we have a lot of regional organizations where it is not easy for them to work together. That means if someone is working in one country, a producer or an investor, it is really a challenge for him to connect or to work on other markets without this region. So even in the region, in Western Africa, you can make your own experience. Moving from Senegal to Cote d'Ivoire or to Togo, you will face a lot of challenge at the border, because even the political willingness is there, the practice is not really applicated. Therefore, you need a functional regional integration. And now we are speaking about a continental integration in the frame of a new African continental free trade area. So therefore, I think it is makeable for Africa, but we need some harmonization of policy. We need some connection on the digital level, and a lot of infrastructure to be able to facilitate this connection and work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time, and most questions in Zoom and YouTube have been answered directly. I would like to thank all panelists for their insightful views. That was really important in shaping our discussions today. The insights, views, and recommendations are highly appreciated. And I assure you that as part of the restart track of ISDB under the MCPS, we will consider all your recommendations in our future interventions. I would also encourage all participants to click the link that was just recently sent of IsDB's first GVC report titled Rebuilding Global Value Chains as Pathway to Global Economic Recovery. This flagship publication was written by IsDB staffs under the GVC community of practice. I would like to summarize that in today's session, we agree that there is a need to rethink with a more targeted policy approach behind the rhetoric of decoupling from the global value chains and find a more inclusive way of sustaining the efficiency-based value chain while ensuring resilience in place. This would require short to medium-term transitional policies that are selective and targeted for the outcome of prosperity in large. With multiple countries taking astronomical new depths as a pathway to global economic recovery, the resources must not fall into the trap of supporting either one of the extreme end of efficiency or extreme end of resilience-based value chain, but rather focus on people-based value chain that is inclusive, creates sustainable jobs, and creates value-added contribution to the economy in the medium to long term. With that, I close this event. Thank you.